Welcome to the Spiderforest Webcomic podcast. I'm Mathieu Moyen. In this episode, Retcon and Reboot. Everyone makes mistakes from time to time, but sometimes an artist realizes they've gone so far in the wrong direction that they need to make a bigger change than usual. How do they handle it when this happens? And what if they feel they need to make the ultimate change and go all the way back to square one? First up, our member Eva brings us a special interview with Karin Rindevall, creator of the comic The Din. Then I'll be back for an in-depth discussion with some more Spiderforest members, Kez, creator of the comic What It Takes, G. Pike of the comic title Unrelated, and Christina Major of the comic Sombulus. It's a good thing pencils have erasers, and we'll tell you why. Stay with us.
Hey, I'm Eva, and I draw a comic called Bits Fair. Years ago, I came across a really awesome action-adventure comic called The Din, and it has a really fascinating setup. In the world of this comic, humanity was reduced and diseased in a big assault, caused by an unknown weapon that makes technology emit a fatal sound. The mission to find the source failed and technology was disposed of. The comic is set in the aftermath of the big assault, when technology is slowly being reinvented with different means by various forces. I interviewed the author of The Din, Karin Rindevall, and I started off by asking her about when she first started posting her comic online.
I think it was 2007, if I remember correctly, because back in 2005 I started to work with comics in general, and then I thought it was a nice idea to maybe make one of my novels into a comic. And I've always posted art and some of my fan comics online, so that's why I made it into a webcomic.
On your website, in addition to your story, I always have found it interesting that you have the whole meta story going with how you have reworked your comic over the years.
Yeah.
That you started publishing it online and then you decided to change it and redo it and start publishing it again.
Yeah, it was a decision I made back in, I think it was 2010. As I have started posting everything online, I noticed that some of my online readers, they had a lot of questions, which made me realize that the beginning of the comic didn't really do the story justice. So I wanted to rewrite it and redraw it into something better so that you would jump into the main story much quicker. I think the reason why this happened is because I was still kind of new with making comics, and I learned as I posted comic pages online and people commented on it. And I think that's a really nice concept of the whole webcomic thing, that you get feedback straight away and can improve. And yeah, it was a big decision to start redrawing, because I think I was 2 chapters in or something when I started to redraw and rewrite the whole thing. But it's for the better, I think. I think it's much better right now.
I think going back and redoing things is exactly the sort of thing that all webcomic artists are advised to never do.
Yeah.
The idea is that if you start going back and changing things, then you will just get stuck in an endless loop of always going back and changing everything and then never being satisfied with the way things already are. So did you worry that you will end up like that, or just end up quitting on your comic after having redone it so many times? Or did you not worry about it and it was a really easy decision once you noticed that there were problems with the story to just go back and fix everything?
Well, of course, I was scared I would be stuck in that endless loop of remaking everything, because I've also heard from other webcomic artists that it's not a good idea to go back and redraw things. But the reason why I thought it was a good decision was because back then, when I wrote the novel, the novel was about 20 or 30 chapters long. And as I started to rewrite and redraw it, I made it into much shorter stories. And right now it's about 10 chapters, I think. So even though it took me a few years longer to redraw the beginning, in the long run it's going to take me shorter time to finish the whole thing, if that makes sense. So hopefully it was worth the time, and I really hope that in a few years I won't do the same thing, realize that this isn't good enough, I want to redraw it. But on the other hand, I think since I made the story shorter, I think I will just go on and finish this project first, and if I'm not happy with it, then I will just think I will learn from my mistakes in this story and do another one and not start over with this very story.
I'm really interested in the process of you looking at this story where you had already drawn some pages and reworking it, because I think you reused some older pages that you had drawn before the second launch of the comic, but you also drew a lot of new pages. So I'm just really interested in how did you look at this story during the time when you weren't posting it online, and how did you work on it to make it into a better comic?
Oh, that's a really difficult question. I think the biggest change of the overhaul of the comic was that I removed all of the dialogue and the parts that wouldn't lead up to the main plot of the story. So the stuff I removed was just pointless dialogue and stuff that you like to write but usually edit out when you write novels. And the pages I could keep, it was stuff that I still thought would make sense to the main plot. I usually plot out everything in very rough sketches before I start drawing it. So when I started to redraw the whole thing, the first thing I did was I made like InDesign document, like a book with these 3 chapters that would be redrawn. And then I looked at the script and noticed that, yeah, this part is almost the same as before, so I can reuse this art. But this whole blank space that is completely rewritten, I need to make new pages. And to make it coherent in style, I did the combination of some pages I could keep the inked artwork because it was all digital, but for some other even older stuff, I had to re-ink and adjust proportions of characters or add backgrounds or sometimes completely redraw some panels and stuff like that.
You mentioned making changes based on feedback, and you also often mention on social media getting feedback from your friends. So how did you go about using feedback when revising your story? How did you make it useful for yourself, and how much do you listen to it?
Well, I try to listen to all feedback, but I write everything down and try to take a step back, because usually when I get feedback, the first thing I do is that I think, wow, this is right, maybe I should change everything. But then I need to step back and think about the bigger picture. What kind of story do I want to tell? Is this something that goes along the lines of the story, the idea of the story I had from the beginning, or is this just the expectations of the reader and some of my friends, and they don't know the bigger picture yet? So that's how I sort out feedback that will be helpful for my story, and how I remove suggestions that won't help me to tell my story. Sometimes it's really hard because you really want everyone to love your story, but in the long run, the creator, are the one who needs to love the story in order to get energy to keep working on it. So yeah, sometimes it's really hard, but I think it's good to take a step back and just look at the bigger picture and what feedback you can use.
You mentioned that sometimes people don't really get what you're going at because they don't know what the entire story will be, but sometimes people misunderstand the story because it's badly written, though. So how do you tell the difference between people not getting it because they just don't know, and people not getting it because you didn't really convey it well?
Wow, that's really hard. I keep getting better at writing, and I'm far from perfect because art and comics is what I like doing the most, and I haven't practiced the art of writing as much. So probably in a lot of cases it might be because I'm not a good enough writer. But yeah, I think along the way I can just improve and try to fix these things that people don't understand. And I mean, a webcomic you don't need to retcon stuff, but you can always fill in the blanks later if people misunderstand stuff. So it's a long journey.
How different is Vedin now compared to the way the story was in 2007 when you started drawing it?
The biggest difference is it's more about the conflict of the world and its people rather than specific characters. Before, you got to jump right into the characters' lives and they were just talking and interacting with each other, and you didn't really know the big problem in the world and why they couldn't achieve their dreams and stuff like that. And people who read the comic, they were interested in why the world looked like it did, and I never actually touched on it it deeply before. And I think in the old script, I wouldn't even talk about the world until maybe chapter 8 or something. And at that current pace of making the comic, it was really frustrating to leave that big important subject out of the comic when the readers kept asking about it. So the biggest change is that I introduce the world in the prologue, and then I keep reminding the readers the conflict of the world and the state of the world. So that's the biggest difference, I'd say.
You have been working on this comic for 8 years now.
Yeah, I think the story is even older, but as a comic it's been about 8 years, yeah.
So what it's like to keep working on the same story for so long, because surely you have other story ideas too. And these other story ideas, at least from my experience, always seem like they are much more fresh and brimming with potential that could be fulfilled, and very enticing to just switch to the new thing and really be creative with the new thing. Because, at least from my experience, when you have been working on the same story for some time, it starts to feel less like you're being creative and just endlessly troubleshooting the story and trying to fix all the problems that you have created for yourself in the past. So how do you carry on sticking to the same story rather than just running off to do something else where it will be easier?
Yeah, that's a fight I fight every day, but I really want to finish this story, and of course I have a lot of other story ideas, but the thing I do to keep it interesting is that I always allow myself to experiment and make changes in the script. And even like some of the future chapters, I decided to change completely since they aren't drawn yet, so I can still experiment with those aspects of the story, like it's a different story. But it's a long distance run to complete a comic like this. But I think once it's done, then it's going to be much more easy and fulfilling to jump to the next story. And of course, I still plot and think about my other stories and sketch and doodle and stuff like that. But I try to make sure that I spend as much time as I can on this project so I can actually finish it, and always think about ways to work faster and stuff like that. But yeah, I try to make it more interesting by allowing myself to change stuff and experiment. So I think that's the key, maybe. I don't know. How do you do it?
I don't know. I'm just searching for answers.
Yeah, but yeah, I truly relate to the troubleshooting route, that sometimes it's just, yeah, you have problems to fix, but I think for me that's what makes it interesting too. So just keep on trucking, I guess.
Well, that was a great interview, and we have some members of our collective here to discuss it a little bit further. With us here today are Kez.
Hello.
G. Pike.
Hi.
And Christina Major.
Hi, how's it going?
I think I'd like to start by talking very directly about what it was that Karin and Eva discussed in the interview. Specifically, that she was very frank about her decisions to reboot her entire comic, more or less from the start. And I'd like to know what you guys think about that.
So I'd heard of the Din before, but I'd never actually read it. So I used the interview as an excuse to jump on in that archive and try and see what she was talking about. And the most important part of that interview to me was how she changed it from being about the characters, and it's now kind of more about what happened to the world. And I guess without having read the original version, I can't really see the changes, but I thought it was a very interesting way to go about completely rebooting, or I should say revising, that comic.
Right. I liked what she said about how even though it was a little extra work to go back and change things, that in the long run she felt like it would make the whole project go a little faster because she was streamlining the story.
Yeah, it's really telling to just focus on your audience's interactions, which is what I got the impression that she was doing, and figuring out, are they getting the information I want them to be getting out of my story? And I really appreciated how she took a look at that reaction and really made the hard decisions to go back, because it's such a personal decision. It's so much work to begin with. And then once you go down a path, when you look back and you're like, okay, I really know where I want to go now. Let's try again. That's a huge decision. That's so hard to make. So yeah, just the work that went into that is amazing.
Well, I think that leads into the first really big point that I'd like to discuss, which is how do you make that decision? I mean, once you've gone down the path of doing a comic for a certain amount of time, you've really committed yourself to a very big undertaking. And the more you do it, the more committed you get. So how do you make that kind of a decision?
I guess I would use the comparison of kind of like climbing a mountain. So making a comic, finishing the comic, is reaching the summit of that mountain. And the only reason that I personally would ever reboot a comic would be if I started up that journey and then I got to basically a place where one could go no further. Either because the time commitment was so absurd that I couldn't finish it, or I got to a point where I hated the journey and I would turn around. Something about the production of it would have to be so time-consuming, something that I hated so much, and that is when I would reboot it. But that's my personal decision. Like Christina already said, it's a totally personal decision to reboot a comic. So I imagine a lot of people would actually do that because of dissatisfaction with where they are versus where they could be.
Yeah, I think the situation I found myself in with Sombulus was I had 3 completed story arcs. I wanted to try to do a Kickstarter, and I wanted to try to bring it to print. And my audience was still really confused about the first chapter, really confused about the first arc. And some of them were telling others, you could just skip the first arc. It's not important. And I was like, what? Oh, gosh. Is that something that's happening? Is that the reaction that readers are having? So that feedback was very important to me, and how I decided to retcon a little bit of my story. Not the whole thing, but like Kez says, just being on top of that mountain, or at least a little ways up the mountain, and seeing, oh, something's wrong here, and I'm not really satisfied with how that went. What can I do? What kind of changes can I make to make that journey better? And sometimes it's starting at a completely different place, but sometimes it's just fixing what you have. Sometimes that's a possibility too.
Yeah, I've never actually stopped midstream on a comic that I was already publishing. In the case of my first webcomic series, Untitled, I actually completed that story once I'd reached a point where I felt like I was getting kind of tired of working on that, and more importantly, I was kind of growing up. I started that comic when I was a teenager, and it sort of represented a part of my life that I didn't relate to as much anymore, but I wasn't done with my characters, and that's why I felt like I needed to do Title Unrelated as a next step, because it sort of represented the next part of my life, and is just a new iteration of basically the same characters, but the story is slightly different. But I did finish the original comic first.
In a sense, then, do you think that you see your second comic as a reboot of the first, or as a retcon of the first?
It's definitely not a retcon, because it's set in a different alternate universe, essentially, that does not necessarily connect with the previous one, but both stories have alternate universes as sort of a plot device in them, so I actually, there's a point where I said in Untitled that, you could have an infinite number of the same person in different universes, but I would consider it more like it is its own story. The stories are not connected. It is just a new iteration, an alternate universe, but not quite exactly the same characters. It's kind of hard to actually explain in terms of rebooting or anything, because the characters have the same names and a lot of the same personalities, but it is a different story.
That's an interesting take on it. My comic, Six Commando, I've never actually actively rebooted it, but it has changed fairly drastically over time. Not in the essential themes or the plot, but the artwork has certainly changed. And that brings me to my next point, which is that over time, your styles and your design work is going to drift. Kez, I know you're doing something with your comic right now that is modifying older pages to match your art style as it has developed over time. You have anything that you'd like to say about that? I think that's a very interesting area.
Well, normally I'd consider design drift to be something very interesting just as a reader to see and to enjoy. For example, Garfield, Calvin and Hobbes, The Far Side. I have these in print, I grew up with them, and you look at the early published works and the design of the characters, it's especially evident in, say, Garfield, completely changes over time. And yet, no one has a problem with this. And the difference with a webcomic, at least for mine, I intend to print it up as one completed volume. So only one book. And because of that, I want the character designs to be very consistent. And it's a pretty slippery slope with a, 700 plus page archive over, I think I'm on year 7 right now, to try and make sure those designs are consistent throughout. So I'm trying to really have a strict diet on how many pages I let myself edit for this sake.
I really think it's important to have rules going into it because design drift happens. Absolutely. You're always going to be able to look back and see, oh gosh, I really could have drawn that thing better. Oh my gosh, what was I doing with hands? This expression is strange. And at some point you do have to say moving forward is more important than moving backward. Don't take time away from your update schedule to fix things, because if you burn out in the middle of that, that'll look even worse than a natural progression of style. And your readers got into your comic for a reason, so there must be something there that somebody liked. Tweaking the dials might change that experience or just take away from what people enjoy about seeing an artist progress. It is a very slippery slope. So yeah, just having rules for yourself about how much you're going to change, why you're changing it. For me, unless it affected how people understood the story, I would not touch the art. And that was a very hard decision sometimes because I knew I was capable of making some drastic changes for the better. But when I was honest with myself, I knew that redoing it all was beyond my ability, would push back my time frame to get things printed, and I was probably going to burn out. So I didn't want to focus on technical rendering or anything, just making the existing story easy to connect with. So that was my approach for it. Those were my rules. And everyone's going to have different rules. Everyone has to kind of draw their own personal line depending on what their goals are.
Like Christina said, it's better to move forward than go back. And the reason I don't write novels is because I'm really bad at editing. I want my first draft to be my final draft. So I guess with regards to how the audience can react to style changes, there's a drastic style change between Untitled and Title Unrelated that actually probably alienated some of my older fans, although I have many older fans who still read Title Unrelated too. But basically, Untitled was a furry comic, and Title Unrelated is not a furry comic, and I did get some backlash over that jump, but since they're different series, it's not like I was retconning Untitled. All of that still exists, and that's why I needed to start a new project with Title Unrelated, so that I could make that change in what I thought would just kind of fit the characters and story a little better, and that's a whole can of worms about why that was necessary, but well, one thing about having older art in your archive, I actually think is kind of important to me because I know that as a reader of webcomics, when I'm going through and seeing the growth of an artist over time, that's actually pretty inspiring because, it shows you what can be if you are dedicated to working on a project in terms of how much better at art you can get from just doing it. And I hope that my work will inspire other young artists because, they can see how, it didn't look as great in the beginning, but in the end, it looks amazing. So that's kind of another reason why I don't like to go back and change stuff, is because I think having that growth path there is important.
If you consider Title Unrelated to be a sort of a spiritual, if not an active reboot of your earlier work, was that something that you saw coming? Did you know that this was a direction you were going to take it? Or was it just something that you felt happened more organically, that you were more willing to embrace as it happened?
I would say that the stylistic change in the art for Title Unrelated was 100% intentional on my part, because I just really wanted to draw the characters fully human, because I felt like Now, things have changed a bit over the last 5 years and so forth, but I felt like I couldn't potentially grow my audience as broadly with the style and format that Untitled was in, so I wanted to have something that was, first of all, drawn digitally, second of all, in full color all the time, and third, had human characters rather than furry ones. So that was all pretty calculated on my part. There was also a personal matter of I was kind of burned out on the art style that I had in Untitled, and I wanted to try new things, basically. And I'd been working a lot on improving my skills in between those two comics, so I felt like I could do a lot more than I did with my older comic.
I think my experience was also kind of similar to G's in that my second comic was a radical departure in style from my first comic. And actually, G, I have to admit, I haven't actually seen your first comic, so stylistically I can't really back that up, but I can only go with what you're saying there. My first comic, The War of Winds, was a full-color graphic novel fantasy adventure, and my second comic, What It Takes, is a monochromatic strip adventure with a much more cartoony kind of style that I didn't really have a good grip on when I started, and I think that's the thing that's bugging me the most when I read through the first few chapters of What It Takes. I didn't know what style I wanted until it organically developed around 200 pages in. And that in itself is really what I want to fix art-wise. And Christina's totally right. I need to probably not let myself focus too much on the artwork because I was so happy with it the first time I made it. And I have to remember that I loved it the first time I made it. And my readers are all like, why the heck are you doing this? It was fine the first time around. So really, I'm doing this for myself just because it's something that I want to do and I right now have the time to do it. But in the end, I think, honestly, if I'm retconning anything, retconning the narrative is so much more important than retconning the art.
Something else that I'd like to get into that you've all mentioned at one point or another, and this gets to something, Christina, that I know you've said in the past, which is that graphic novels or online comics of the sort that we do, they're not a sprint, they're a marathon. You have to be willing to be in it for the long haul, and in that sense, the urge to change, to reboot, to start something new, or to take what you've already done and change it around to match the experience that you've gathered up over time can become a really strong urge. And in a certain sense, you could consider that a reaction to a kind of writer's block, or, if you want, art block. Is that something that you feel like you have to get past? Or do you think that even just sort of toying with it is itself a way of coping with that kind of urge that I think all of us get to at some point or another?
There's definitely that urge. There's a strong desire to really fix things, and sometimes you need to. Sometimes it's very therapeutic to go back and take a look and see, what have I done? What can I grow with? But just be sure that you have rules in place, that you know why you're doing what you're doing. There's nothing wrong with having fun and saying, okay, here's some art from 4 years ago. Let's see if I can do that better now. Let's see if I can make that expression better now. That can be a very rewarding experience. But as far as continuing the marathon of creating your content, you have to get to the finish line sometime. That's just, you need to keep going forward, and you need to be honest with yourself if you keep looking back forlornly at this well-trodden path of pages that you've done and things that you need to improve, or things that you kind of think you might need to improve, and say, okay, is that preventing me from moving forward? Am I just doing this because I don't know where my plot is going next? I don't know how to go forward from here. And we've all been through that one point at the story or the edits where writing is too hard, and gosh, yeah, it's just easier to draw something fluffy or interesting. Just trying to be honest with yourself and make plans, break it up, try to move forward as best you can is always going to be my recommendation.
I think I want to be really clear about why it's working for me at this point in my process for What It Takes, that it's okay for me to go back and do this. And that's because I'm toward the end of that marathon, and I'm seeing that finish line. And as this finish line is quickly approaching me, frankly, too fast, because I have a lot of stuff that I need to do in my life after I finish the comic, because I can see the beginning and the end at the same time. I think it is a smart decision for me creatively right now to go back and do that. But the trap, I think, for creators who have just started out on this marathon is that they might only be a few steps in, and then they're like, oh, I could have done that better. Let me go back and fix that. Or maybe they're a chapter in and they think the same thing. Definitely retconning, rebooting, whichever of these processes we want to talk about, it's not something I ever recommend for someone who isn't either preparing something for print or preparing to finish the comic in general. And while nobody asked for my advice, you're getting it. Sorry.
Well, if they're listening, hopefully they're trying to get some advice from us.
My advice when it comes to this issue is basically, as a writer, you need to be a little clever and sneaky in the beginning. First of all, you should write your ending first. That's my first piece of advice. And second, in the beginning of your story, you should probably allow, if you don't have a really definite idea of how the middle and the climax of the story are going to go, be a little bit vague in the beginning so that as you come up with those details later on, you can kind of make it seem like you meant for them to be there all along. You can go back and look at stuff you did in the beginning and use that to tie into a plot twist or even something that is a sneaky retcon, let's call it, where you change something that might have been implied early on by revealing that, oh, well, it was a faulty narrator or someone misunderstood something or a faulty memory or something like that, So that's kind of how I do it, is by looking at what I wrote in the beginning of the story and, as I'm making decisions on how to get through the rest of the story to the goal at the end, I can look at what I already put in there and try to use those things to make it seem like there was more of a long plan, which there was a plan. It's just, I've rewritten some parts of Title Unrelated 5 or 6 times as, I come up with better ideas for future parts of the story, or I reinterpret older parts, or I think of something in a character's backstory that's important that I didn't mention earlier on. All kinds of things like that. There's a lot of ways you can do that as a writer, as a creator, without actually changing anything in the previous parts of your story.
I really like that advice, G, and I'm so glad you said that because I do that all the time. You just set up a bunch of Chekhov's guns and you set them on the wall, right? And then, you pull down the ones that you want to use maybe and like leave the rest on the back wall there. And maybe they'll come into play later, maybe they won't, but that gives you more options and just having things be a little fuzzy or like you said, the faulty narrator aspect where someone's telling you something is the way it is, but you still have that little noodle room. I think the noodle room is important when you're moving forward with a long form comic that, you just want to be able to give yourself that room for better interpretations and better ideas. So yeah, I think those are really good points, especially when you're doing these 7 or 8 year comics that are going to go on for who knows how long.
Well, and I'd also like to add that I don't think that there's anything wrong with changing your mind either. It's just a matter of how far do you commit and how flexible are you willing to be when you're planning out a story. You can go all the way on one side and do what Chester Gould used to do, he was the creator of the comic Dick Tracy. Don't know if anyone remembers Dick Tracy, but I sure do. And he never wrote more than 1 strip in advance because he figured that if he didn't know what was going to happen next, then nobody else would, and that would keep people coming back. So that's about as far as you can go down the road of flexibility. But you can go too far in the other direction, too, and really write yourself into a corner, and then how do you get out of it? And then you've sort of manufactured your own kind of writer's block. You've written yourself into a place that you don't know how to get out of, and then the urge to retcon or to reboot your comic becomes even stronger than ever. And although I've never gotten there with Six Commando, I certainly have artistically for some time. And one of the hardest things for me to do has been to follow what I'm now going to refer to as Christina's rule, which is just don't go back and change it because you can. Go back and change it only if you absolutely have to. because there was a time when I was working on Six Commando when I took a month off and said, all right, I'm going to get this together. I'm going to redraw all of this artwork the way I really wanted it to be and do like my director's cut. And a month later, I had just spent all this time redrawing all of these comic pages, and they were the most detailed and best thing I could possibly do. And I had just redrawn maybe a third of the first chapter and realized that I was changing the whole story without even realizing it. So that's the other direction that you can end up going. So don't go that far. The director's cut is always the goal, it's always the option that people tend to seek out. But you can do that so much that you can end up reaching a point where you're no longer really able to add anything to what it is that you've created. And in the sense of adding something else, you're actually changing it into something that it wasn't before. And that may not always be a good thing. And to take us to the final point that I'd like to discuss here, if we could, I'd like to talk about, again, really about reader reactions. How do you manage your audience when you're making these kinds of changes? If it's a change for the better, do you then feel pressure to go further? Or if it's a change that you might not predict, how do you, or how would you, if confronted with this, manage an audience that might respond in unpredictable ways? Is it the same as managing an audience the first time you come out with a comic, or is it something more complex than that?
I got a lot more feedback on Untitled because I think webcomic communities were kind of different back then. I had a dedicated forum for my comic, and a lot of regular users who were, a lot of them I'm still longtime friends with. People would have little discussions about everything, and sometimes I would draw something badly and they would point it out, and I'd be like, oh... But I still didn't go back and fix it usually because that would have been difficult at the time because it was traditional media. And I sort of wish sometimes that I got more feedback for Title Unrelated. I can assume that lack of feedback means I'm doing a good job in terms of that sort of thing. But since I don't get a lot of feedback on Title Unrelated, I feel like all of my readers are super chill and understanding about the story that I'm doing. For whatever reason, I never tend to attract people who are super entitled or ungrateful. I did get one hate mail about the pacing one time, but I think that person was just kind of mad because I didn't draw furries anymore. So, yeah, I don't know.
Christina?
For me, audience reaction was super important. And it's not only about audience reaction and doing whatever somebody says in your comment section that you should do. That's not what I'm talking about here. It's looking for patterns. It's looking for multiple people having a stumbling block or finding something confusing in one place. And that's how you pinpoint what you're going to change. Another part of it is getting a trusted beta reader feedback group going. And the Spiderforest forums is a great place for that, by the way. You can post your things and get good feedback. But for me, that was essential, just being able to figure out what they could understand and what was still too obscure. And it took me a good 6 months of iterating on the backside. I really did try to get all of my edits, my retcon stuff done on the back end so I can look at it from start to finish and say, okay, is this a good direction? And then upload that whole thing in one chunk. I know some people do, just a page at a time or something like that. But I think if you're going to go that far to edit, you really should change an arc or change a set of pages. And then if your readers trust you, if they enjoy what you're doing, and if you're exhibiting good judgment based on what they had problems with and what your beta readers were noticing, I don't think you're going to have many problems at all. And if you have the one person who's emailing you because you're not drawing furry comics anymore, you do not have to listen to them. You have my permission to ignore them.
Well, thank you.
Yes?
It's really good to use your readers as a barometer for what they're understanding in your story or what they're definitely not understanding in your story. And sometimes it can be very unwise to use them as a barometer for art or style or that sort of thing. Sometimes it's unwise and sometimes it's wise. It really depends on who your readers are. For my personal experience, I use my readers mostly as a way to figure out if what I'm having the characters say without outright outright coming out and saying it, if that is being adequately translated and understood by the people who are reading it. Sometimes it feels really clumsy in the narrative to be like, oh, this person is definitely the person who did this other thing that I didn't tell you about before, but I, lay 2 or 3 hints at it and hope my readers understand it. And when they express confusion, that's something that I'll jot down to remind myself to edit later when I'm getting ready to do final revisions. And so, like I said before, the artwork, while I'm spending some time modifying it right now because of my stylistic drift throughout the story, I'm going to be spending the most time editing the narrative to make sure that it's understandable and also true to the characters, because my characters, and I assume it's the same for most artists, writers, the characters change over time as you grow to understand them. At least if you don't have the entire work finished when you start, as G recommends, which I also recommend, but I do not follow my own advice, so there's that. And so that's mostly what I am trying to go back and do, character consistency, and take into account what is stumbling my readership more than what my readership does or does not like.
To add to what Kez said, in terms of clarity for the readers, I think the main things over the years that I did take away from Untitled to use in Title Unrelated were some of the things that readers found confusing, such as not being able to tell characters apart from each other, which was something I was very guilty of when I was a teenager, but I was a teenager, so what do you want? And also, using characters' names a lot more frequently, because I feel like a lot of writers don't use their characters' names in comics enough, so the readers don't remember what the characters' names are, and I struggle with that too in other people's comics. And I feel guilty about it when I'm talking to someone whose comic I actually have read for once, and I can't remember their characters' names. So that is something that I feel like I'm taking from Title Unrelated in terms of reader feedback, is that sometimes readers could not remember all the characters' names, and that is something I definitely need to work on.
I think that's so succinct and yet so pragmatic. If you can't remember the characters' names, boy, maybe that's a sign you've got bigger problems.
People don't say people's names normally. I totally get that. Like in normal conversation, you don't say someone's names every other time, but it can be months between pages and yeah, it's easy to forget that stuff. So put that stuff on a character page and just integrate it into the dialogue much more than you necessarily think naturally. I get what you're saying. It's hard sometimes.
To be fair, I have a lot of characters in my comic, so it's understandable. I can't blame them.
Well, it also goes to the fact that, you may know more about your comic than anybody else does, and you may get so close to it that you don't realize that it's something that is that seems obvious to you may not be obvious to them, and that, if we had to come up with rules, that might be a rule in favor of a retcon or a rule in favor of a small reboot in the interest of clarity.
Well, I think it's something to clarify, perhaps, for anyone listening in, is, and maybe I'm the only one with this differentiation here, but I consider there to be very strong lines between revision, retconning, and rebooting. And these are 3 very different things to me. Revision is something that I think everyone should be doing when they notice that their readers are confused. You might revise a piece of dialogue to add names in it so that your readers are less confused. You might retcon something that requires a few pages or panels to be changed in order to provide clarity for future actions. And you might totally reboot something when you just hate your work, don't like where it is, want it to be over and to go up a completely different set of activities or actions in your story. But revision is a good thing in my book. It's something that everyone should be doing when they notice a problem.
Well, I'm afraid that once again we've run out of time. This program is a production of the Spiderforest Webcomic Collective. Our executive producer is Christina Major, and Eva is our audio engineer. The The Spiderforest Webcomic Collective is a creator-owned organization funded by voluntary contributions from our members and from readers and listeners like you. Thank you for the support, and remember that, as always, you can help us out the most by going to spiderforest.com and reading some of the over 70 webcomics written and drawn by our members. We create comics of all genres, and we make them all available to you for free. Plus, you can join the discussion on the Spiderforest forums, interact with our creators, and much more, all at spiderforest.com. You can even help us to produce more comics and podcasts too by clicking on support to make a donation. Any amount, even a few pennies, helps to fund our work, and we are grateful for your assistance. I'd like to thank our special guest for this episode, Karin Rindevall. You can read her comic The Din at dincomic.com. Our thanks also to Eva for bringing us that interview. I'd also like to thank our members who participated in this episode's discussion, Kez, G. Pike, and Christina Major. Kez produces the comic What It Takes. You can read it at acityinaplace.com. G. Pike produces the comic Title Unrelated. You can read it at titleunrelated.com. Christina Major produces the comic Sombulus. You can read it at sombulus.com. Eva produces the comic Bits Fair. You can read it at bitsfair.com. And I produce the comic Six Commando. You can read it at viciousprint.com/sixcommando. I'm Mathieu Moyen. Thank you very much for listening, and we'll see you next time.
You know, we should just reboot this one.
Oh.
Oh, I said it.
Yes, that's right. I went there.